Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the seminar series in Southeast European Studies. I am Eric Gordy. I am coordinating the seminar for this year and trying not to overdo the feedback on the microphone, because one thing we have discovered is that with this little device that you see in the back of the room, we can record this event, and we will record it, and it'll be up there on the SSEES YouTube channel for people who are not able to come here to watch. And I'll just introduce this very quickly and say this is especially exciting. I am always pleased when we're able to do an event that features the work of our students. And tonight we'll be bringing to you two of our students. So Georgio Konstandi, who is doing his master's here, did a project over the summer at the Srebrenica Memorial Center in Potočari, turning archival material from the center into educational materials, and he's going to present that. And then we have as our respondent, Sarah Moore. Sarah is our doctoral student working on gender and public memory in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And she will give a quick response about what, at least in her mind, was the most inspiring and uplifting bit of Georgio's presentation, after which we should have plenty of time for discussion, for questions, for answers, for comments. With that, I will stop talking and I will hand this over to Georgio. Your show, Georgio.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today, what I want to try and do is walk through some of the major questions that sort of came about as I was researching in Srebrenica. I'm going to also present the project that I'm currently working on, the educational project, and hopefully that will become clear exactly what that means. But as we're going through this, I just want to talk, I'll be sort of framing everything within the concept of how we remember and memorialize genocide. Obviously, this is a genocide that happened very recently. The survivors are still with us and are the people who are leading the research in the region. And so we have, this is, this window of time that we have while we still have the privilege of talking to the survivors and working with them, is one that we should be very aware of. And I hope that the research that I'm doing and this project in particular can contribute to that. Before I start, I think it's important, to give a content note warning. There is not going to be any graphic images or footage, but there will be, in-depth discussion of all the things that you can see on the screen. I wanted to start with this quote because this, I think, gets to the crux of what I hope the project is going to do, which is to unsilence aspects of the genocide in Bosnia that have not been given space or do not fit into the mainstream focus, particularly in the media and even in research. When it comes to genocide, we tend to be very focused on the mass killings. And in terms of the genocide in Srebrenica, the 11th of July and the days that followed. And when I arrived in Srebrenica, one of the first conversations that I had with one of my colleagues who survived the genocide was that they, as a memorial center, had stopped agreeing to give interviews to Western journalists about the genocide because they are sick and tired, in their words, of being asked about that one day and that one day alone. So hopefully what I will be able to do today is sort of present to you all aspects of genocide that aren't getting the attention that they deserve. To start by just presenting to you my project, the Genocide Education Project, you will notice there are two titles. That's because we are yet to decide which one to use. So I'll let you know when that decision has been made. But this is the outline of the project. When I was in Srebrenica, I was collating oral and written testimonies from survivors from Eastern Bosnia. And I'm going to talk in more detail as to why the focus is on Eastern Bosnia. The testimonies that I've collated are going to be used to create a timeline, a social media style newsfeed. And we're going to simulate what will look like a Twitter feed. That's the format that we're going to use, as if the people in Eastern Bosnia could have posted what was happening to them as it was happening. It goes without saying that this is how the majority of us receive news today. We've all done it. We're all doing it with Ukraine. We're doing it with Iran. Anytime there is a major event, it is predominantly through our social media news feeds that we receive on the ground information. Now, obviously, the people of Eastern Bosnia in 1992 to 95 did not have that luxury. And hopefully this project will retrospectively give that to them. And then once the timeline has been designed and created, we will be collaborating with schools, universities, and informal educational groups to then use that as a resource for teaching students about the genocide in Eastern Bosnia. Just some quick background information on Srebrenica, on the genocide in Srebrenica itself. I'm sure most of you will be aware of these facts, but just in case anyone is not familiar with what happened, as far as we know today, there have been 8,372 remains of bodies, and I have to stress remains of, not complete, of Bosniaks who were killed in the mass killings in July 1995. The mass killings were committed by Serb forces who were under who were being led by General Ratko Mladic. Srebrenica, of course, was a UN safe zone, which had no legal obligations as to how that zone was supposed to be kept safe. There were other terms that the UN could have chosen, which would have obliged them, would have given them certain obligations to actually enforce it. The UN chose safe zone, and the results of that ambiguous phrasing, we can see the results. This is the result. But what I'm going to be talking about now is everything that came with the killings. The killings of July 1995 were a culmination of a broader genocidal campaign. And at the beginning, when I said that my colleagues in Potočari no longer give interviews to Western journalists because they're sick and tired of being asked only about the 11th of July, this is one of the key reasons, is that my colleagues have said to me that they are so frustrated that people outside of Bosnia don't seem to be showing the same interest in everything that preceded the genocide, the mass killings themselves. So through my research, when I was there, I was able to find out a lot more about the different aspects of 1992 to 1995 and how the siege of Srebrenica, the attacks on Bosniak towns in Eastern Bosnia, how these campaigns affected people's everyday life and how people lived with it, because it was a reality they had to live with. It was not something that they had to experience in one day. This was a 3-year experience that they had to survive. One of the things that my project is hoping to do is to help us rethink chronology. And going back to what I was saying a minute ago, this focus on the 11th of July as encompassing the genocide is perhaps not helpful and also not reflective of the reality. Emir Suljagic, who himself survived the genocide and with whom I had the privilege of working when I was in Srebrenica, he writes about hunger. Hunger being the central factor of everyday life for 3 years. And this is going to be one of the key themes that I talk about today. Every day, wondering how you are going to eat anything and how that affects your interpersonal relationships with everyone around you. And I'll talk about that in more detail. aside from the hunger, perpetual terror, living in a state of perpetual fear that this day will be your last, or the last day for your loved ones. This is all part of the genocide. And so when journalists conduct interviews with survivors and only ask them about what they were doing on the 11th of July, this is what we're missing out. This is what has been silenced. So going back to the first quotes, I am hoping to contribute to that unsilencing of all these other aspects of the genocide. Another aspect, another element that I'm hoping to contribute into rethinking is the geographical scope. Srebrenica was one place in eastern Bosnia. It is the only place where The Hague recognized what happened to be genocide. However, as the vast majority of survivors will say, this does not mean that similar things did not happen elsewhere. Now, the Drina Valley, the Drina River, which forms much of the border between Serbia and Bosnia, the Drina Valley was incredibly important to the Serb nationalist imaginary in the 90s. In May 1992, the Serb Assembly, which we will be talking about in more detail later, set out their 6 strategic goals. And one of those goals was to eliminate the Drina Valley as a border between their so-called statelet, Republika Srpska, and Serbia. Now, obviously, if you want to eliminate that as a border, and you've got a very multi-ethnic demographic in that area, that's going to involve ethnic cleansing. And that's what happened. You know, there's a quote that I put there from which I translated from one of the transcripts of the Serb Assembly, a quote which was, you know, it's not unique. There were the gist of this quote of what Rajko Dukic was saying was echoed by many other Serb nationalists at the time. And that geographic scope, Bijeljina in the northeast, all the way down to Foča in the southeast, is what our project is encompassing. So we have included testimonies from survivors from across that region. The focus is Srebrenica because that's where the most data and the most content and material is, but we have included events from across the Drina Valley because you cannot understand what happened in Srebrenica in isolation. That's why we decided to do this. And I've listed the places in the Drina Valley or around in Eastern Bosnia that we have included. And something else that I, you know, encourage us all to think about is the way that the different communities across Eastern Bosnia became interwoven with each other as a result of the forced displacements, being on the run, and everything that was happening to them in the 1990s. For example, Srebrenica itself, during the siege, the majority of people who were trapped in Srebrenica were not people who were born in Srebrenica. But they became, and this is something that hopefully will become clear, they became a cohesive community as a result of being scattered across Eastern Bosnia, you know, faced with the Serb onslaught. And this sketch, by the way, this drawing is, if anyone has the chance to go to Potočari, you can see this drawing as part of an exhibition by Bosnian artist Nermina Memić, and she's done some amazing work in helping to express some of the aspects of the genocide. So one of the key sources that I used to do this project was the oral testimonies that were conducted and given to the Srebrenica Memorial Center. And there were 2 exhibitions that the Memorial Center gave that I've used in particular, and they were the exhibitions Life Behind the Killing Fields and our story. Life Behind the Killing Fields is something that you can all access online. There were 100 testimonies. They've now added 100 more. Naša priča, our story, is an exhibition that is at the Memorial Center. And what that exhibition does, and why I think it's so incredible, and why I decided to use those testimonies, is it gives schematic interviews with people who were trapped in Srebrenica and people who were in Eastern Bosnia. So you have interviews just on hunger, for example. How did hunger affect everyday life? You have interviews just on what women were doing during the siege and how they were organizing. You have interviews on life before the siege. So this was why I decided to use these resources. And what these two main banks of oral testimonies show is they reinforce what I was saying earlier, which is that the genocide culminated in the killings. It did not begin with the killings. And the multiple stages of the genocide, some of which I will talk about, were not necessarily happening in a linear fashion. It was not necessarily first this happened, then that happened, then that happened. Often it was multiple stages of the genocidal campaign happening at once. So you had the shelling that was constant, and you had the perpetual fear of how am I going to eat today? And you had people being taken away and sent to camps, and then the odd person coming back, all happening at the same time. And something else that I hope to do, not just in this project, but in my research, is to contribute to the historicization of emotions. Because something that became clear through these oral testimonies, and I was also lucky enough to sit in on live interviews when I was there, is how there's a whole plethora of emotions and emotional processing that the people of Srebrenica and the people of Eastern Bosnia and the people of Bosnia in general have had to go through during and after the war. And the historicization of these emotions, of anger, of fear, of guilt, of internalizing orientalizations inflicted upon them, these processes, we still need to historicize them, we still need to research them. The other key source that I used for the project was the genocide papers. Again, accessible online on the Srebrenica Memorial Center's website, not in English at the moment. So these are transcripts of every single session of the Serb assembly that took place in the lead up, during, and just after the war. And what I will be talking about today is that when I was researching these transcripts, this was, for want of a better phrase, this was a gold mine of actually understanding how the Serb nationalist elites discursively othered, orientalized, reconceptualized non-Serbs, but in particular Bosniaks. They were the #1 target. They were the #1 group that the Serb elites were determined to reconceptualize. They were reconceptualized as Turks, for example, and we'll talk about that. And then what also became apparent as I was researching the transcripts, particularly towards the end of the war, was that there was another focus that was coming into view, and that was trying to ascertain which Serbs are true Serbs, which Serbs are loyal, and which Serbs have been corrupted through various different things, and we'll talk about that later. And finally, in these transcripts, what was key and what we absolutely cannot forget is that the Serb elites were banking on Europe buying this narrative, that they were fighting extremists, that they were fighting against a threat to all of Europe, which was Islam. And they explicitly said this, that Islam was trying to penetrate Europe and that they were the last barrier. They were banking on Europe, believing this, and Europe did or enough of Europe did. And that's a reality that has to be included in how we remember the genocide that took place. If we talk about the discursive othering of Bosniaks, this is something that the Serb elite did very effectively. In the transcripts, when I was researching the transcripts of the Serb assembly, not once did the Serb elite call Bosniaks Bosniaks. They were called Muslims or Turks or Ustaša, who were the Nazi puppet regime in the independent state of Croatia in the Second World War. They were not once called Bosniaks, and that was purposeful, because part of this othering process was to claim that the Bosniak people were not a people. And they were selling this reconceptualization to the so-called international community. On the 8th of January, 1993, the Serb Assembly actually had a debate on whether or not the Bosniaks are a nation, are a people. And the conclusion of their debate was that the Bosniaks were a communist invention. And of course, if you're an invention, then it's a lot easier to eliminate you from any given region. And we'll talk more about what the Serb Assembly had to say about communism, which was also very revealing. But this nationalist rhetoric, this reconceptualization, Aleksandar Milicevic, a scholar on who researches, if I'm not mistaken, gender and nationalism, she says that the argument that the ethnic nature of the genocide in Bosnia was driven by ethnic entrepreneurs, in other words, the elite, is inadequate. Because what that does is that turns the community and civilians into, it reduces them into passive beings, having things enacted upon them that they don't necessarily participate in. Instead, what Milicevic suggests that we do is to view the discursive otherings and the discursive violence that preceded the genocide as an interactive process between community and elite. And through these two main sources of testimonies and archives, in other words, the genocide papers and the oral testimonies that I was researching, I was able to see this interaction. Because on the one hand, I was reading what the Serb Assembly was saying. On the other hand, I was listening to what survivors were saying their Serb neighbors and colleagues and bosses and policemen were saying and doing to them. So I could see this interaction. So to talk about the bottom-up responses to the reconceptualization of Bosniaks as a non-people, there were a few key themes that I noticed in the oral testimonies that talked about the days and the months preceding the outbreak of the war. One of those themes was that Serb co-workers began to segregate themselves away from their Bosniak colleagues. And I have to stress, I'm talking about Eastern Bosnia now. So these testimonies are from survivors from across the Drina Valley. That was one motif. The other motif was a change in behavior among neighbors. And one of the survivors who will feature on our timeline, Eshefa Alic, she talks about how one day she was having coffee with her neighbor, and her neighbor was cleaning out a closet, and out fell a uniform. And Eshefa Alic could recognize that it was a Chetnik uniform. And when she asked her neighbor what it was about. The neighbor brushed it off as, oh, my husband needs to clean out his wardrobe. So these were two motifs that I noticed in the oral testimonies, particularly as regards the lead up to the war. And something else was children being given this nationalist rhetoric and then repeating it. And this testimony from Kada Hotic, I've decided to paste it onto the screen because I think it highlights exactly what I'm talking about. This happened in the lead up, in the days and weeks preceding, in the lead up to the war. And what you can see here, just through this testimony alone, is the effectiveness of that reconceptualization. So when we're learning about the genocide that happened in July 1995, hopefully we can see already that just focusing on July 1995 is not adequate. It doesn't give us the full picture. And I can understand now why my colleagues in Potočari no longer give interviews to Western journalists about July 1995. Because no one seems to be interested in this. I apologize if some of it has cut off. That's a formatting issue. But you should be able to see as well, I've just included some bite-sized quotes from the Serb assembly. Again, notice the dates. This is preceding the build-up to the outbreak of the war. The way that they began reframing Bosnian independence as a threat. And they were banking on Europe buying into this. I have to repeat that. I could have included many more quotes, but I didn't because there just isn't enough space. But this will all be on the timeline, by the way. This will be on the social media newsfeed that we simulate so that students who are learning about the genocide can understand, okay, this is what was happening before the killings began. When I was in Srebrenica, I was being interviewed by a Turkish journalist, and they asked me, how is it possible that a genocide happened in Europe? Which I don't like that framing anyway. I think that's incredibly problematic. A genocide shouldn't be happening anywhere. Europe is not special. But she asked me that question. And this is what I pointed her to. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It was very, very well thought out by the perpetrators. There was a whole infrastructure behind the killings. The second thing that I would like to talk about, and this was something that became very apparent when I was researching the testimonies, was hunger and the effects of hunger. The quote at the beginning, one of the quotes that I put at the beginning of the presentation from Emir Suljagic, he says, hunger was a key part of everyday life for 3 years. And what I have observed when I was researching the written and oral testimonies is the way that hunger was so pervasive. It permeated through every aspect of interpersonal relationships. It changed the way that neighbors of the same ethnic group interacted with each other, because suddenly you're competing for food. You're competing for survival. It changed the way parents and children interacted with each other. In a minute, you'll see some quotes from 2 survivors of Srebrenica. And one of them talks about how interactions and daily interactions with his mother changed because people became so hungry that everything seemed to be a fight, and suspicion and cynicism began to kick in. And we shouldn't romanticize the resilience of these communities. The idea that they just pulled through is not adequate. If we're to stop viewing survivors as just survivors and start seeing them as human beings, then we have to unsilence all of the emotions and changes and reactions and responses to hunger as part of the siege. Because as human beings, it was not all positive. I've put some key emotions, feelings that really ran through these testimonies: anger, fear, cynicism, but also compassion. And these were all interwoven into everyday life. Hasan Nuhanovic is one of the survivors who will be featured on our timeline. And on our timeline, I should have specified this earlier, as well as the general newsfeed that we will be simulating, we will also be dedicating pages to individual survivors who have given so much information about life between 92 and 95 that we are able to give them a full page just following their story from the beginning to the end of the war. And Hasan Nuhanovic will be one of those people. Something that Hasan talks about in his written testimony, The Last Refuge, is the way that hunger began to dehumanize everyone. And it's going back to what I was saying a minute ago. These instinct to survive and the instinct of self-preservation permeated every single relationship, family units, friends, the whole community. There was something else as well that became a running motif in the testimonies that I was working with in terms of hunger. And that was the way that it forced people to do things that they thought were humiliating, such as walking to, I say nearby, they were not near, they were kilometers away, but nearby villages to beg for food. And this was something that affected the parents in particular, who were having to knock on people's doors and ask for food. And sometimes, by the way, the answer was no, because either we don't have any or for other reasons. Hasan also talks about an altercation that he had with his mother during the siege, where they had enough raw ingredients to make something like bread, but it wasn't bread as we know it and as they were used to. And the hunger had been, this particular moment in his testimony is around 93, 94. So this was well into the siege, and they'd been dealing with hunger now for, years, 1 year, 2 years. And he thought that his mother had given his brother a bigger slice. And he talks about how he reacted, and then couldn't believe how he had reacted to his own mum. And when we talk about historicizing emotions, and the emotions that come with genocide and living in that perpetual state of fear and survival mode, that's part of it. This is why we shouldn't romanticize the resilience, because as amazing as it is that these people managed to improvise and find a way to survive, it was not always, a bed of roses, particularly, as I said, when it comes to emotions, and how hunger permeated through every single interpersonal relationship. Another individual who will have a page dedicated to their story from start to finish is Emir Suljagic. In Postcards from the Grave, again, he talks about in a lot of detail the way that hunger changed him and changed everyone around him. Again, it's this motif of being dehumanized, and something that, one of the arguments, and I use that word with inverted commas, from genocide relativists today is that, well, 8,000 men and boys were killed in Srebrenica. The whole community was not destroyed, not genocide. or something along those lines, a diluted version of that rhetoric. But actually, first of all, that's not true, because the Genocide Convention says that destroying a community in parts or in whole counts as genocide. But secondly, what we can see through these testimonies is the way that even before the mass killings of July 95 happened, people were reduced to shells of themselves, and they were dehumanized on a daily basis. By the way, even when the international community finally decided to do airdrops of food, the food was first of all not enough, and people were still being dehumanized, being shelled, having to fight for food, etc. Something else that I am trying to help to unsilence with this project is the experiences of Bosniak women. The mass killings of July 1995 were predominantly, almost all of the victims were men and boys. That is not a fact that we should try to reimagine to fit into something that we find, a narrative that we find more palatable. Bosniak men and boys who were killed in July 95 are victims in their own rights. We don't need to reimagine what happened there. Having said that, we should give due space to the intersection of oppressions in which Bosniak women found themselves. An intersection because first of all, they were women, and secondly, they were Muslim. And some of the things that we are going to show in the project, in the timeline, is how that intersection of oppressions played out for them during the war. One of the things that happened was genocidal rape. There is huge stigma, obviously. There was a huge stigma in Bosnia and the region when it comes to talking about genocidal rape for lots of reasons, which, you know, I don't have time or the scope to go into now. But we are going to include stories from women who endured and had genocidal rape inflicted upon them. Unfortunately, due to the stigma surrounding speaking out, we don't have as much material to work with. But through the ICTY trials and the documents that are available on the ICTY's database, I was able to find material for the women of Foča. The women of Foča were Bosniak and Croat women who were held in an array of detention centers where they were continually attacked in this way. I've also included on the slide Vilina Vlas, because for those of you who have not heard of this place before, I think it is always important to mention and talk about Vilina Vlas. It was a rape camp. Today, Vilina Vlas is a hotel and spa. No memorial, not even a plaque. Advertised on the Republika Srpska's tourist board. Has a website, has an Instagram page, looks very pretty. That's something else that has been silenced. And what I'm hoping to do is to be able to include information about Vilina Vlas. It's very difficult to actually get testimonies about it, but definitely we will do everything we can to include information about what happened there on the timeline. Again, these are parts of the genocide in Eastern Bosnia. I'm focusing on Eastern Bosnia because of practicalities. It's very difficult for one individual to cover the whole of Bosnia. And secondly, because as I was saying before, the Drina Valley was key to the Serb nationalist imaginary. One of their 6 strategic goals, eliminate the Drina as a border. When we're talking about the genocide and the genocidal campaign in Eastern Bosnia, we have got to unsilence the genocidal rape. There's something else as well that we're going to include, which is equally worthy of our attention. And that is that even women who were not detained, who were not taken to rape camps or detention centers, were at risk of being abused. And there's one particular moment in the testimony that we will be including, and this was in the testimony of Emir Suljagic. And he talks about how a UN official who was part of the peacekeeping force, who was in a senior position, approached him and asked him if he could give him a Bosniak woman. Emir refused, but he later found out that the UN official found someone to give him, to traffic him, a Bosniak woman. These were women who were not detained. They were just trying to survive in a town under siege. This has to be part of our memorialization of the genocide. When we talk about unsilencing, this is what we have to unsilence. Bosniak women trapped in Srebrenica and in other enclaves in Eastern Bosnia also organized. They organized exceptionally well, given the circumstances. On the screen, I've included a photo of Dr. Fatima Klempic-Daltbasic. She was a doctor at the wartime hospital in Srebrenica, and the testimonies that I have read and listened to from both herself and Dr. Ilya Pilav, who was another doctor in the wartime hospital, describe unimaginable scenes. This was a hospital that was operating for most of the war with no anesthesia, with no basic medicinal supplies. They were amputating people without any anesthesia and giving them alcohol, which thins the blood, before amputating what needed to be amputated. Women giving birth without basic medicinal needs. Supplies. They also, Dr. Fatima Klempic-Daltbasic talks about how they were afraid to use any water because they were fearful that Serb troops surrounding Srebrenica had actually poisoned the supply. But they still managed to operate in that hospital. Another key point of organization among Bosniak women was the Women's Active in Srebrenica. And the work that they managed to do during the siege of Srebrenica was incredible. It was heartbreaking and horrific, but it was incredible that they managed to do it. One of the key moments that I remember and will be included in the timeline, is when the president of the Women's Active, Fatima Husejnovic, decided that when Serb forces shelled the playground in Srebrenica in April 1993, killing children, men and women, Fatima decided that the Women's Active were going to collect all of the remains that they could find, put them somewhere safe, so that after the war was over, the victims' families would be able to actually give them a dignified burial. This was another example of how women were organizing under impossible conditions. Dr. Haris Halilovic talks about another phenomenon which is women who have survived the genocide being the only archives left of their murdered men, their murdered husbands, brothers, uncles, cousins, sons. And again, we have to go back to emotions here, because one of the things that became very apparent to me as I was listening to and reading oral testimonies from these women was the various layers of emotions they were having to deal with long after the genocide finished. And I've listed 3 key feelings, emotions that they expressed in their oral testimonies. Trauma goes without saying, but disbelief that they were unable to stop their husbands, sons, brothers, uncles, grandfathers from being killed. Guilt even was expressed in several oral testimonies. Could I have done something else to save them? I wish I hadn't have stood in front of him, instead behind him. Or I wish I hadn't have told him to go in this line, but for him to stand here. These were all things that were expressed several times by these women. This drawing, again, on display at the Memorial Center, is from Belgrade artist Jelena Jachimovic, one of the most powerful exhibitions I've ever seen. And in this particular drawing, we can see women who were being deported out of Potočari, having just had their brothers, husbands, sons ripped away from them as they were walking onto the bus. And you can see, instead of their faces, we can see in that drawing, I'm not sure how much you can see from where you're sitting, but you can see the final things that their husbands and sons said to them. And 2 phrases that must have come up dozens, I would even say hundreds of times in the testimonies that I've included are "Vidimo se mama" and "Čuvaj mi djecu." See you soon, mum. Look after the kid. And I think it's so important that when we're remembering the genocide, that we don't just say Serb forces killed 8,372 Bosniaks. That we say all of this that was happening, the interpersonal quick exchanges in the seconds and minutes just before, and how the survivors have to deal and live with these final moments. This is all part of historicizing emotions as well. Going back to the word guilt, disbelief. Finally, I also want to talk about nation building, which was a key part of the genocide. I said at the beginning of the presentation that it's not adequate to just say that the ethnic nature of this violence was all manufactured by the elites. That's not enough. It's not adequate, because that reduces civilians to passive actors, just having things done to them and not actually participating. Nonetheless, we do have to look at how the elite tried to build this perception of a Serb nation. And there were some moments that I was quite surprised to find when I was researching the transcripts of the Serb assembly that I wanted to talk about. One of the things that I read was a debate that was had in the Serb assembly as they were, now that they had ethnically cleansed parts of Banja Luka and other places, they wanted to install their own purely Serb judiciary. And so they had to decide who they were going to nominate. And you would think that it would be pretty easy. A Serb is a Serb. No, because they have to be the right Serb. And there were many interventions during the debates, as people's names were being mentioned, oh no, we can't vote for them. They like Muslims. I would rather vote for a Muslim than for him. He's a traitor. This is important. This is all part of the nation building behind the genocide. I also said earlier on that I was going to talk about communism and how that was weaponized by the Serb elites. At this point, I'm going to say, and it's very important to say this, that in these Serb assemblies, it was not just politicians who were taking part. It was also priests and bishops, archbishops. The Serbian Orthodox Church was a major player in the genocide. And the reason why I say that is because the next quote comes from a priest. And the priests who took part in this assembly were very vocal about their hatred for communism and anything that could be associated with communism, including the so-called fictitious Bosniak nation, who were a communist invention, according to the Serbs, the Serb elite. And this fear of communism became more and more vocal towards the end of the war, when the Bosnian Serbs when a rift began to appear between Milosevic and the Bosnian Serbs. Milosevic, who was happy for the war to be concluded, and the Bosnian Serbs who wanted to go full steam ahead with their ethnic cleansing. And with this rift came this added focus of, okay, well, who is a true Serb? In fact, Radovan Karadzic in the assembly describes the rift between them and Milosevic as a rift between son and mother. And so they became obsessed with working out who was a true Serb. And one of the frameworks of that was honest Serbs and red ideology, or communists. There was also another debate that they had, again, crucial to understanding how nation building was behind the genocide and how it was a key part of enacting this genocide. Because once you've eliminated the other, you have to then decide who you are. Who is this nation then? And so they had a debate in the Serb assembly on whether to reject Iakavian or not. And there were some Serb politicians who wanted to remove Iakavian, which is one of several ways of pronouncing words in the region, in Serbo-Croatian. And in Serbia, a majority of people, or the official, the majority of people in Serbia would use Ekavian, but again, not all. It's very complex and too complex for me to go into. And in places like Croatia, it's mostly Iakavian, but it's very complex and it doesn't stick to geographical borders. But they had a debate over what to do about it. And what was interesting is that they ended up deciding not to reject Iakavian, solely because then that will be giving something to their enemies. And actually, they wanted to say this is Serb as well. So these are all complex nuances to what the elite was doing behind the scenes to build this nation that they wanted. By the way, a nation that they got rewarded by the international community. Let's remember that as well. They were rewarded their Republika Srpska. Two other moments that I want to talk about to finish with. And again, this now is looking at bottom-up responses to this nation building. We cannot deny the level of civilian participation in the genocide. It wasn't Radovan Karadzic who was driving the buses. It wasn't Radovan Karadzic who was digging the mass graves. There was civilian participation. Of course there was. But there were also other responses too. It wasn't a monolithic response from the community. Two moments stand out to me from the research that I did. One of the Bosniak survivors of the genocide in Srebrenica talked about a moment that happened to almost if all of the buses that were deporting Bosniak women and children and some elderly people as well out of Srebrenica. And this is something that happened to pretty much all of the buses, which was the buses were stopped, Serb soldiers or paramilitary forces entered the bus, committed atrocities or made threats to commit atrocities, and then the bus continued. And this particular survivor, who was anonymous in the trial, which is why I haven't put their name, speaks about a moment where her bus was stopped and a Serb paramilitary troop enters, made the usual threats of what he was going to do to the people on the bus if they didn't give him everything that they had. And the bus driver told him to leave them alone. Then the paramilitary troop tells the bus driver that he would be next if he didn't shut up. Now, the troop did actually get off the bus, didn't do anything. And this survivor tells the court that she noticed that the bus driver, who was Serb, was crying. This is important to include. This is all part of responses to what was happening. As I said, the civilian participation cannot be denied and shouldn't be denied. But neither should these nuances as well. These rare moments of humanity. The final moment I want to talk about is, again, about a Bosnian Serb civilian called Nesko Djokic, who in July 95 was working on his farm when a group of Bosniak men who looked visibly like they had just been through something, who had been walking through the woods, as thousands of Bosniak men and boys did, to avoid being killed. And by the way, most of them were killed anyway while they were in the woods. A group of Bosniak men arrived at his farm and asked for food and clothes, and he gave them food and clothes. And then they left. And then Nesko Djokic was arrested and brought in for interrogation for helping the enemy. And what was interesting when I was reading the archives from the Serb police was their paranoia that things were not going their way. Remarkable, given that they had just killed 8,372 Bosniaks. Remarkable that they had succeeded in their ethnic cleansing and were about to be awarded their statelet. They still thought things were not going exactly as they wanted them to go. This will all be included in the project. So to conclude, I started at the beginning of the presentation with that quote, "Humanities is the great unsilencing art." So what are we trying to unsilence? We're trying to unsilence every facet, every layer of the genocide, moving away from just thinking about the genocide as being the 11th of July 95. We hopefully can see now that's not adequate at all. And it doesn't do the survivors any justice. It doesn't do the victims justice. We are unsilencing the emotions that were wrapped up in surviving, the anger, the fear, the cynicism, the betrayal, the compassion, the community, communities that were destroyed and regenerated. We are unsilencing the way that interpersonal relationships changed and were put under unimaginable pressure. As I mentioned before, families began to view each other differently because suddenly everyone was competing for food. And I'm not trying to say that people started to attack their own family. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is interpersonal relationships were put under pressure. How do I stay human whilst being treated like an animal? That's what we're going to show here. That's what we can see being expressed in these testimonies. We're going to unsilence hunger as part of the genocide. And we're going to unsilence all those other areas of Eastern Bosnia that don't get included in the mainstream narrative on the genocide. Of course, Srebrenica is going to be the focal point. That's where most of the material comes from. But you cannot understand what happened in Srebrenica without understanding what the Serb forces were trying to do across Eastern Bosnia. The Drina Valley had to be theirs. They said that. And we're also going to unsilence anti-nationalist responses to Serb nation building, like the rare moments that I mentioned, because that's important too. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, I think Sarah's going to ask questions first. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, and also, if you want to follow the project, that's it on Twitter.
Oh, wasn't sure if it was something. I do apologize for my coughing bit. I'm just coming towards the end of quite a bad cold. Yeah, it's definitely not COVID. That was a really wonderful and well presented presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure we all enjoyed it here as well.
Thank you.
I really like that you reiterate the fact that this didn't just happen overnight. It was not something that was spontaneous or spur of the moment. It was a strategic construct that had been devised over several years and implemented over several years. And the book that I'm reading at the moment refers to it as a genocide in slow motion, which begs the question of why wasn't there international intervention soon? Why did it allow to escalate and build into what happened in the summer of 1995? And also hunger. I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because again, the text that I'm reading is from survivors, and hunger is the recurrent theme. And incidentally, it was also one of the themes that drew a lot of people to Srebrenica from the surrounding villages, because they survived for as long as they could. And then when the area was like a designated safe area by the UN, people went to Srebrenica believing that they could of course gain safety, but also alleviate that hunger. Ultimately, the several thousand refugees increased the need and competition. Sorry, I just wrote loads of notes basically. It was so interesting. Okay. And the use of like oral testimony, I think, is really interesting as well, because when you read about scholars who interact with survivors, the overwhelming feeling is that they just want to talk, they just want to be heard. And it says a lot of survivors sort of go into kind of monologues almost, because they're just relieved at this ability to have their story heard. And the ICTY, they wasn't particularly appreciative of these stories and the emotion of it, because they're just trying to secure a purely judicial outcome. And one of my questions that I'd like to perhaps ask you is, prior to the conflict breaking up, there were these efforts at dehumanizing and othering Bosniaks. Hunger is an example of that. After the war, obviously, the Dayton Peace Agreement sort of legitimized the genocide efforts by establishing Republika Srpska. And even today, there are still dialogues being had about how to remember the recent history. And I don't know whether you would agree or disagree that that sense of almost dehumanizing and denial is still being perpetrated.
Yes, I agree 100%. If we look at I would talk about two things in terms of today, in terms of the present day. It should not be normalized that a genocidal regime has been awarded their genocidal state. That's not normal, and that's not right. We should not be normalizing the Republika Srpska. And that's not a radical thing to say. Perhaps if I was Muslim, they would call me a radical, but I'm not. So I'm going to say it. Secondly, the rhetoric that we see from the leaders of the so-called Republika Srpska is a continuation of the rhetoric from the 90s. In a recent report that a certain Milorad Dodik wrote for the UN, he described young Bosniak men in mosques as a security risk. I would like to show the UN some of the people who go to Orthodox churches, and we can have a conversation about security risks. The rhetoric has not. If it has changed, it's just evolved. I would say it perhaps has evolved to become more palatable. So yes, okay, it's not as palatable today to call a Bosniak a Turk openly. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but I'm talking about political exchanges. But what we talk about now is security risks. And I do think that, you know, we're still living in the post 9/11 legacy. And our ideas and perceptions of security risks, I think, are still shaped by that. And I think that these perpetrators know that. And so, yeah, the rhetoric, I could talk about this all day, I'm not going to, but yeah, the rhetoric has not gone away. And, you know, this othering of Bosniaks as not welcome in Europe is not something that would be sustainable without the tacit approval of European officials. It's no secret that people like Dodik meet with EU officials from Hungary, from Germany, from other places. If he didn't feel empowered enough to continue with this rhetoric, it wouldn't be happening to this degree. I would go as far to say that Europe has a problem with Muslim communities in Europe. The idea of Muslim communities strong, with an army, with a democracy that works. I think Europe has a problem with that. It's not part of my research, but that's what I would say.
No, I agree with you. And I think it's also furthering of these Serb narratives that are that were perpetuated towards Europe and Western leaders throughout. I'd just like to open the floor now because my voice is failing me. If anyone has any questions, or if Eric wants to come and
I'll just grab the microphone so that when people have things to say, I can bring it to them.
Yeah.
Let's start in the back here, because this way I get in my 10,000 steps.
Sure. No, not talking, not bad for you.
Hi, a really good presentation. I think one of the things you mentioned was in Srebrenica, most people weren't born and weren't from Srebrenica.
Yeah.
I was wondering why, is there an underlying reason why that is the case? Like, was it because of due to 2-3 years of poverty and, you know, all the things that were going on, perhaps people from nearby towns and villages then came into Srebrenica in order to flee from kind of Serb forces? Is that the reason why, or was there any other underlying reason why that was the case?
Yeah, good question.
So let's get you 2 or 3.
Okay. Wait, am I going to have to remember 3 questions?
Do you have a pen?
Can I not just answer one at a time?
If you want to.
I'll be
Okay,
quick.
Yeah.
I'll be quick.
Okay. I'll
All
stand
right.
over here.
Thank you. My poor brain can't retain 3 questions. The reason why the majority of people who were trapped in Srebrenica by 1992, 1993 were not born there is because these were refugees who were fleeing the Serb onslaught from surrounding villages and towns in eastern Bosnia. Plus, those people who could escape beforehand had escaped. And yeah, and obviously the non-Bosniak population in Srebrenica had left already. Which is another important thing to say. The non-Bosniak population in places like Srebrenica had begun organizing before the siege began, and they had left. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I can say it's one of the 3 safe areas that have been declared by the UN. So in addition to Srebrenica, there was Gornaj and Žepa. These were places where there was at least a declared intention of the UN to protect them from attack. So people came there.
I'm sorry, I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is about the title. It was interesting that you said you weren't sure as
Yeah.
to whether to use Srebrenica Calling or to refer to the Drina. And I just would like you to answer in a bit more detail what your thoughts are,
Yeah.
whether you're considering taking Srebrenica out of the title.
Yeah.
Because it seems to be that, okay, this relates to the second part of the question, who is the audience of the project?
Okay.
Because if the audience is people in the West, perhaps Srebrenica is at least a well-known name. But you might want to draw emphasis on the wider
Yeah.
Eastern
Yeah.
genocidal project. So yeah, that's.
So you've just outlined the debate that's happening at the moment really well. I'm the person who's saying we should do Voices from the Drina. There are other people who think otherwise and think that perhaps because our audience is British educational institutions, that Srebrenica would be a good title to include. I think that there are arguments for both. I think that, I personally feel uncomfortable with the idea of using the name Srebrenica as like a brand, just to get people interested. So I'm pushing for that not to happen. However, I also understand that, that with everything that you do, you need people to actually know what you're talking about. So yeah, it's a good question. And my view is that it should be Voices from the Drina, but I'm not in control of everything. Even I'm not in control of everything.
We have a name, yes. Let's go for Steven. Go to you. How am I going to get to you?
I'm gonna break this.
Bye.
Hello.
Hello.
First of all, thank you very much for this presentation. I think it was really important to do this here and have such an attendance. I'm actually shaking. So on another note, there's two things. First of all, I think you mentioned of unsilencing the past. I think an important read that you could do for the theoretical also framework of what you're doing and for the whole work of the Assembly of the RS is Silencing the Past by Trouillot, which is one of the major books of post-colonial studies about this question of history and how they try to prevent its transmission. So I think that would be interesting. There's also an article I can send you from Tomislav Dulic on the conceptualization of genocide that would, I think, help you on this work. Otherwise, I had a question regarding the participation of civilians actually from the Serbian population, which was, did you have any interviews on, I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but on the sense people who were in apathy or who were forced in some way to partake into these actions? Thank you.
That's certainly something that we want to do moving forward. I was only in Srebrenica for 2 months. There was only so much I could do. And the difficulty is that people are not necessarily forthcoming to talk about that, particularly, people among the Serb population in Srebrenica and in the region. One of the first things that I was told when I arrived is, as soon as you enter Srebrenica, you don't tell anyone where you're working because you don't know who you're going to be talking to. So that's the atmosphere that you're dealing with when you're there. It's not an open space for open discussion. So the answer is no. At the moment, I have not been able to interview people about apathy and about that side of things. However, in the testimonies that we have included, the survivors talk about what happened between them and their Serb neighbors and their Serb co-workers in the lead up. So I think that we do actually get to show that to some degree. But moving forward, you're absolutely right. That will be the goal, to include stuff like that as well.
Yeah, hi. Very interesting project, and like Traffic says, very obviously important project. But I was just going to ask about whether you saw in your research when you were looking at records of discussions in Serb Parliament and the dehumanizing of Bosniaks, whether you found specifically within the Parliament whether there was any opposition to that, anyone speaking up against genocidal rhetoric, or was it a total consensus?
To answer, was there any opposition? No, there was no opposition. I don't have a more complex answer for you. No, there was no opposition.
Okay, I'll get to you next. Sorry,
I probably have a loud enough voice. I think, going to. Hi, thank you so much for
yeah.
the brilliant presentation.
Thank
I hope you don't mind, I'm going to shift the focus slightly.
Okay.
So in recent weeks, you've become quite the internet sensation on Twitter in your recent battle to take down a film screening of Republika Srpska. And I was wondering if you could talk more about how those two things are actually connected to the work that you're doing. You know, how by allowing genocide deniers platform across Europe to show this film, you know, is actually very connected to perpetuating violence. So if you could talk more about that, that would be brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you for asking that question. I did not ask Rhea to ask that question, just to make that clear. Yeah, so for those who are unaware, a Serbian Canadian director whom you may have heard of, if you are blissfully ignorant, I'm now going to tell you who he is, Boris Malogurski. He used to work for Russia Today and Sputnik, and he has made a series of films on different aspects of the region's history, which completely changed the narrative. He's done films on Kosovo, and now he has made a film on the so-called Republika Srpska with the title Borba za slobodu, the struggle for freedom. Boris Malogurski had made this film over the space of 2 years, and he had a film release scheduled across Europe, not just in private places, but in cinemas across Europe, Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, Slovenia, Italy, Serbia, Bosnia. Thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars have been put into this film. In the space of 10 days, myself and my colleagues managed to shut down every single cinema screening. But the important message is not actually that. The important message is that the genocide continues. Didn't end in July 1995. Didn't end with the Dayton Peace Agreement. I would actually say that the Dayton Peace Agreement entrenched the results of the genocide. And this is, to go back to your question of how they linked, if we're thinking about, you know, as a human society, who do we reward and who do we punish? It is absolutely unbelievable that the international community decided we're going to award the perpetrators of genocide with their statelets, with the one that they wanted. And so what that allows to happen is that 30 years later, you have relativists and deniers able to actually profit from that and build careers on changing the narrative, because the international community has recognized them as legitimate. So the fight continues every day. And, you know, I also think that it's important that we cannot leave that fight to Bosniaks alone and Bosnians alone. If we're doing that, we're part of the problem. It's as simple as that. So when I have been interviewed, and afterwards the interview finishes and my Bosnian colleagues will say, you were very angry in that interview. And I said, yes, because I can be, because they're not going to call me a Muslim extremist. So in every fight against an oppression, we all have different roles to play. And we shouldn't feel guilty about our privilege, but we should use it. So the relativization and the denial of the genocide, it has been enabled and made easier because the international community said, yes, you can have your statelets. We recognize it. So the genocide continues, and these projects, you know, not just this project, but so many others, what hopefully they will allow to happen is for people's first entry points into learning about Bosnia will be truth and not relativization and not misframings and not false narratives. Good question.
Thanks. Let's give you, Giorgio, just one more, and then we'll let you off the hook.
Okay. Best or last?
Yeah, we don't know that yet.
I am the last. I hope not, but okay. So I'll try to be short. So I also want to say that you can invite me every time you want. I will find time for this because this is very important to me too. So as a diplomat, as a PhD student, as somebody who was 15 when war started, yes, I'm that old. I remember how it was in that system, how it started, what happened. I can relate to every theme you mentioned because you actually touched the themes. You can speak for days, and you and me, I know we will speak for days, and I promise help. And you are the proof that you don't have to be Muslim or Bosniak to understand this theme. This is universal theme. I'm here because there are 10 stages of genocide. Denial is the last stage. And I'm here because the war that we are having after Dayton is happening in lecture rooms, in media. It's happening everywhere. It's just twisting. You would believe that if you have the whole court, if you have verdicts, if you have so many proof, if you have pioneering science called forensic happening in your country, that would be enough 30 years after. Yesterday, two important things happened. We had speech, ranting speech of Milorad Dodik, who denied again everything, who had so many followers on his speech. They had a speech because election committee of Bosnia and Herzegovina is actually threatening they're going to repeat the elections. So his army of followers are threatening that they will make a mess, that he didn't steal the elections. His opponent says differently. As you said, there are different kinds of Serbs. And I need to relate to that because that was a question. As a Bosniak, as a Muslim, as somebody who know what happened to my country, I need to say there were not just few people. They were in small number, but every town, every village, every place where they did what they did had also intellectual elite, had people who were doctors, who were professors, who say, I don't want to kill my pupils. I don't want to kill people that I'm curing. We have our Hippocratic command also. Those people were first to be killed. Those people are also heroes. Serbs were also, small percentage of them, but they were also in the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Some of them were hitting with grenades their children in the towns if they discover overnight that they married a Bosniak woman. They didn't have a problem with that. So there are different kinds of, even if that's percentage, maybe I don't know this, even if that percentage thank you. Even if that percentage, we cannot really define, these people deserve respect. And that was the truth because they were in minority, so they were completely eradicated, them and their families, if they didn't run away on time, if they stayed to help their neighbors. Some of them succeed to survive and help their neighbors, you know, playing on both parts, like they are the good Serbs, but in the same time, they did what they could do because they warned, they tried to help. They were just the victims in the situation. So good people try to stay good people, even in the worst situations. And we have stories like this. So thank God that brings back hope to humanity. So I will just say a few more things that I think is important. So Google that speech, find somebody who will translate. So we have on the 26th of October 2022, we have speech of the guy who said, he's president of the Republika Srpska. As you said, that's awarded crime, genocide, ethnic cleansing. He's behaving like they are leaving tomorrow with half state. They can do it if he's not going to get these elections. He's also saying that people who are serving in world kazamats, kazamat is a Russian word you probably know because you're in this department, jails, that they are actually great leaders, that they are not like worse criminals after Second World War. I mean, there is a book called Butcher of Bosnia that Julian Borger did. Julian Borger was one of the British foreign reporter. You should call any one of them who can be here to give you the lecture because they are amazing. And they are all active and they are writing books about Bosnia, making films about Bosnia, giving lectures wherever they are invited. I know them, they're my friends. We go to that Frontline Club I mentioned to some people. Frontline Club is a place of war memorabilia. So what I wanted to say, also one more thing, and then I will stop and then you can call me whenever you want. I know you called Ambassador to give a lecture. Ambassador actually told me to go and give a lecture. Then I told him that he's ambassador, that he should do that if he was invited. But anyway, I would like to do it whenever you want. We'll find the time. So I will just conclude that with that, when people say Turks and Bosnian Muslims, so I live in the center of Sarajevo. Sarajevo is called, for every tourist that ever visited Sarajevo, they know we are called a little Jerusalem for a reason, because on 500 square meters, you have cathedral, you have Orthodox church, you have mosques, you have synagogue. That is Sarajevo. Before Second World War, every fifth citizen of Sarajevo was Jewish. So Sarajevo and Bosnia are very interesting and very complex. And what you also probably didn't know is when Osmanic Empire came to Bosnia, to Balkans, so it was 1463. In May of that year, Sultan Mehmed Fatih II, he gave, that was the first document of that kind in this region called Adnama. That means that he gave it to Bosnian Croat. It was, we call them Franjevci. It's the order of Catholic faith in Bosnia. So that document gave them right to have their religion, to have their rights, to live peacefully among other, different religions. Nobody can touch them. So after 500 years, we have different religions, so that is proving how prejudice can be completely strong. So this is emotional for me. I'm probably forgetting to say something important. Other important thing that happened yesterday, Faruk Shehic, that you mentioned also, that our best writer of new generation and regionally awarded and internationally awarded writer, made an article for Guardian. It was actually not originally for Guardian, but Guardian published it. And it's a good message for the end. He actually says that he knows that Ukraine can win their war because we did it against all odds. And it's a good article. You should read it. You will learn a lot about Bosnia and everything else. I'm here for you and for everybody else. And I wanted to say that first, but then I forgot. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for being different, for not being typical, because usually people, of course, in this department, I expect people like you, but so many times in the world, and London is different, thank God, people have these prejudices, and people forgot that we are all the same, and that we should not allow anything that's against human rights to anybody, because when you put label to somebody, then we are not humans anymore. And as a diplomat, I live for the day where human rights will have like a bigger value in this world and people in general. So yeah, thank you.
Well,
Did you want to respond?
I feel like you said everything. I don't know what I can add to what you've said. The only thing I would say in terms of the speeches that we're hearing from people like Dodik today is, it goes back to what I was saying before. These people have been rewarded with something, so that's why they are emboldened to say what they're saying. And just one more thing I will say, actually, you were talking about these anti-nationalist responses from the Serb community, and hopefully I hope that I made that clear in my presentation, that these people deserve space and respect for not buying into the nationalist nation building that the elite were trying to build. I come from, this is important to me on a personal level. I come from a community where there is mainstream othering of Muslims. That's fact. I come from an Orthodox Christian community. So I understand, trust me, I understand how difficult it is to go against that current. So that's why I will be including those stories of solidarity in the timeline.
Thanks, Georgio. I know I said one more, but what I meant by that was that there would be one more after that.
You meant a bulk and one more, so that's fine.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm a human rights barrister from Pakistan. I'm really happy to be here. I have to say that, like the most of my nation and our ends of the world, We are very much unaware of what happened in Bosnia, even though we share immense amount of sympathy with other countries like Burma, Palestine, Kashmir. I'm Kashmiri myself. I have to say that our countries severely lacked information. And my question is, how can I understand the whole, these people are Muslim extremists. So, we've embraced it at this point, to be honest. Like, we know that we don't have media in our favor and, we just do our thing. My question to you is that, how do you see, or what role can countries that are a part of the OECD, Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, that Qatar, like all these massive, very influential Muslim countries that understand that this has happened, but don't understand the magnitude of help that is required? And what role can nations like these play in the future to bring more power and more rights to the people that have faced these injustices in the future? And brilliant presentation. I hope to learn more about it, but that is my question. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I am happy to hear that your community is embracing the labels that are being, or hopefully reappropriating the labels that are being thrown at you. During the campaign that I was talking about, I myself have become a Bosniak Albanian lobbyist, apparently. So I'm also embracing those labels as well. I think that, listen, my research is very historical based, so I'm going to try and answer as best as I can, although I'm not the most qualified voice on your question. I think that there are two things I would say. I think that Bosnia is cursed with its geography. It's a majority Muslim nation in a majority Christian or perceived majority Christian continent. That can't be changed. Ultimately, it's Europe that needs to get its act together. It was Europe that was okay with watching 100,000 Bosnians be killed. It was Europe that was happy to award, and the West was happy to award the perpetrators of genocide with their own statelets. So ultimately, whether we like it or not, the change has to come from Europe, because what Pakistan or Malaysia thinks or tries to do will only have limited effect, in my opinion. One of the international the international body and offices that is supposed to be ensuring peace in Bosnia is the Office of the High Representative. It's if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, Samara, but it's usually statelets. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's an entity. Yeah.
But we're moving to the end.
I was just going to say, the Office of High, yeah, of course, it's an entity. Yeah, they wanted their own state. Yeah, yeah. The Office of High Representative, which is supposed to be ensuring peace in Bosnia, it's almost always, as far as I'm aware, it has always been a European official that has filled that role. I may be wrong, but certainly recent times. And we have a high representative today working with ethnic nationalists to entrench their power in the Bosnian political system. So to go back to your question and try and answer it, what can other nations do? Education is really important. They've got to be teaching this in schools. They've got to be teaching this everywhere. So if, nations like Malaysia, Pakistan want to help, the number one thing I can think of is teach your generations, your upcoming generations, about what happened to Bosnia. But Europe has to change. Europe is in crisis, not Islam. Europe's in crisis.
Well, thank you very much. Thank everybody. I'd like to thank everybody for your questions and comments and contributions. And could we just take a moment to appreciate Giorgio and Sarah for the presentation.